ignore me, huh? You think this is funny? You're going to come out here right now and explain why my kid got dragged into your mess. Don't you dare hide behind this door. I saw what you did down the block. Everyone saw it. And if you think I'm letting it slide, you're wrong.
The afternoon sun hung low over Meadowbrook Estates, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and freshly painted mailboxes that lined Sycamore Drive. It was a Sunday, the kind of lazy weekend afternoon when most people were inside enjoying the air conditioning or maybe firing up the grill for an early dinner. The temperature had climbed into the low 80s, and a faint breeze rustled through the oak trees that gave this particular suburban enclave its picture-perfect character. Nothing about this day suggested that something extraordinary was about to happen. Nothing hinted that in just a few moments, a piece of technology no bigger than a human fist would capture evidence that would ultimately reshape the lives of everyone involved. At 3:22 in the afternoon, the smart doorbell camera mounted beside the front door of 847 Sycamore Drive activated its motion sensor. The small device, installed almost 2 years earlier for basic home security, began recording in crystal clear high definition. What it captured over the next several minutes would eventually be viewed by millions of people around the world. It would be analyzed by attorneys, discussed by legal experts, and shared across every major social media platform in existence. But in that moment, as the recording light blinked silently, nobody could have predicted the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Standing on the front porch, just inches from the camera lens, was a woman in her early 50s. Her name was Diane Whitmore, and she had lived in this neighborhood for nearly 18 years. Her face was flushed with anger, her jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in her neck stood out like cables. She was wearing a pale blue cardigan despite the warmth of the day, and her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a severe ponytail that seemed to emphasize the hardness in her eyes. Her right hand was raised, index finger extended, pointing directly at the camera as if she could somehow reach through the lens and touch whoever was on the other side. The words coming out of her mouth were not the words of someone lodging a simple complaint about a minor neighborhood disturbance. They were something far uglier, far more revealing. Every syllable was being captured, time-stamped, and automatically uploaded to a secure cloud server. Every facial expression, every gesture, every hateful phrase was being preserved in permanent digital form. Diane Whitmore had no idea she was being recorded. She thought she was simply talking to a doorbell, venting her frustrations to a small electronic device. She would later claim she forgot the camera was even there, that she never intended for her words to be heard by anyone other than the family inside. But intentions matter very little when the evidence is right there in high definition. Before we go any deeper into what happened that afternoon and everything that followed, I want to take a moment to connect with everyone watching this. If you find yourself drawn to stories about justice, about ordinary people standing up against discrimination, about the power of documentation in an age when so many incidents happen without witnesses, then this channel is for you. Consider subscribing if you have not already, because what you are about to hear is just one example of the kind of in-depth, carefully researched stories we share here. Now, let us get back to Sycamore Drive and the events that would change everything. The family inside the house was the Washingtons. Marcus and Denise Washington had purchased their home on Sycamore Drive nearly 4 years earlier, making them relatively new additions to a neighborhood where many families had lived for a decade or more. They had 2 children, a 12-year-old son named Jalen and a 9-year-old daughter named Maya. Both kids attended the local schools, played in the community sports leagues, and had friends scattered throughout the surrounding blocks. The Washingtons had done everything right. They had saved carefully for their down payment, qualified for a competitive mortgage rate, and chosen Meadowbrook Estates specifically because of its reputation as a safe, family-friendly community with excellent schools and a strong sense of neighborhood pride. Marcus worked as an operations manager for a regional logistics company, a position he had earned through 15 years of dedicated service and steady promotions. Denise was a registered nurse at the county hospital, working 3 12-hour shifts each week in the intensive care unit. They were, by every reasonable measure, exactly the kind of hard-working, responsible homeowners that any neighborhood would be lucky to have. Their lawn was always neatly maintained, their property taxes were always paid on time, and their children were polite and well-behaved. Yet from the very first week they moved in, Something had been wrong. Diane Whitmore lived 3 houses down from the Washingtons in a brick colonial with white shutters and an immaculately maintained flower garden. She had been among the first to notice when the moving truck pulled up that August morning nearly 4 years ago. She had stood on her front porch, arms crossed, watching as furniture was unloaded and carried through the front door of what had been, until recently, the Morrison home. The Morrisons had been a white family, well-liked in the neighborhood, active in the Homeowners Association. When they announced they were relocating for work, several neighbors had expressed curiosity about who would buy the property. The answer arrived on that moving day, and for Diane Whitmore, the answer was apparently unacceptable. Within the first month of the Washingtons settling into their new home, the complaints began. They started small, almost insignificant in isolation. Diane filed a report with the Homeowners Association claiming that the Washingtons' trash cans had been left at the curb for 12 hours after collection day, a minor violation of the community guidelines that was routinely ignored when committed by other residents. A week later, another complaint arrived, this time alleging that the family's vehicles were being parked in a way that partially blocked the sidewalk. An accusation that turned out to be demonstrably false when Marcus provided photographs showing proper parking positioning. The complaints kept coming, week after week, month after month. The grass was cut too short. The grass was cut too late in the day. There were too many cars in the driveway during a birthday party. The children were making noise in the backyard after 7 in the evening. Each complaint, examined individually, might have seemed like the concerns of an overly particular neighbor, the kind of person who simply had too much time on their hands and too little tolerance for normal residential activity. But the Washingtons began to notice a pattern. They started paying attention to whether similar standards were being applied to other families on the street. They watched as other children played loudly in other backyards without any apparent consequence. They observed other trash cans sitting at curbs well past the pickup window. They noted other vehicles parked in arguably more obstructive ways, yet the complaints, overwhelmingly, were directed at them. Denise had tried in the early days to address the situation directly. She had walked over to Diane's house one autumn afternoon, about 6 months after they moved in, bringing a plate of homemade cookies as a peace offering. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say, something along the lines of hoping they could start fresh, that she valued being a good neighbor and wanted to understand if there was anything specific bothering Diane so they could work it out like reasonable adults. The encounter had lasted less than 2 minutes. Diane had opened her door, seen who was standing on her porch, and immediately hardened. She accepted the cookies with a curt nod, offered no invitation to continue the conversation, and closed the door while Denise was still mid-sentence. The message was clear without being explicitly stated. Over the next 3 years, the Washingtons developed a strategy of meticulous documentation. Every complaint that came through the HOA was filed away. Every incident, no matter how small, was written down in a notebook that Denise kept in the kitchen drawer. They installed the smart doorbell camera not out of any particular suspicion, but because several other homes in the area had been targeted by package thieves, and it seemed like a reasonable precaution. They had no idea that this security device would eventually become the most important piece of evidence in a legal battle that would consume nearly a year of their lives. On that Sunday afternoon, the events that triggered Diane Whitmore's appearance on their front porch were remarkably mundane. The Washingtons had decided to rearrange some furniture in their living room. They were moving a couch from one wall to another, repositioning a bookshelf, making space for a new entertainment center they had purchased. These are the kinds of activities that happen in homes across America every single weekend. There is nothing unusual, nothing disruptive, nothing worthy of complaint about homeowners adjusting the layout of their own interior spaces. Yet at some point during this furniture rearrangement, the sound of items being moved must have carried through the walls, across the lawn, and into the ears of Diane Whitmore 3 houses away. Denise was standing in the living room holding one end of the couch while Marcus guided the other end into position when her phone buzzed with a notification from the doorbell camera. Someone was at the front door. She set down her end of the couch and pulled the phone from her pocket, expecting to see perhaps a delivery driver or one of the neighborhood kids looking for Jalen. Instead, she saw Diane Whitmore, and she felt her stomach tighten with familiar dread. Marcus noticed the change in his wife's expression. He walked over and looked at the phone screen, seeing their neighbor standing there, already visibly agitated before anyone had even responded to her presence. The couple exchanged a glance, the kind of wordless communication that develops between partners who have navigated difficult situations together. Neither of them moved toward the front door. Denise tapped the button to activate two-way audio, allowing her to speak through the doorbell speaker while watching and listening through her phone. She had learned through experience that face-to-face interactions with Diane tended to escalate in ways that could later be disputed. The camera and microphone provided a buffer, a record, a witness that could not be accused of misremembering. The first words out of Diane's mouth were about noise. She complained that she could hear thumping and banging coming from the Washington residence. She said it was disrupting her Sunday afternoon. She demanded to know what was going on in there. Her voice was sharp, accusatory, carrying the tone of someone who believed they had every right to demand an accounting of activity inside a home that was not their own. Denise took a breath, reminding herself to stay calm, to not give Diane any ammunition that could be used against her later. Through the speaker, Denise explained that they were simply rearranging furniture. She pointed out, as neutrally as she could manage, that it was the middle of the afternoon on a Sunday, well within any reasonable hours for normal household activity. She reminded Diane that they were homeowners, just like everyone else on the street, and that they had every right to move furniture inside their own residence. Her words were measured, reasonable, the kind of response any person might give to an unreasonable complaint. She hoped it would be enough to end the conversation. It was not enough. Something shifted in Diane's expression, something dark and ugly moving behind her eyes. The veneer of concern about noise began to crack, and what emerged from underneath was something that had clearly been festering for years. Diane's voice rose in volume and dropped in register. She began talking about how the neighborhood had changed, how things were not the way they used to be. She used phrases that carried unmistakable meaning, talking about certain kinds of people and where they belonged and what was appropriate for this particular community. She never used explicit slurs, but she did not need to. The message was transmitted clearly through coded language that has been used for generations to communicate exactly what she was communicating. Denise stood frozen in her living room, phone in hand, watching this woman expose herself in real time. Marcus had moved closer, looking over her shoulder at the screen. Their children were upstairs, thankfully absorbed in their own activities and unaware of what was happening on the front porch. That was a small mercy. The idea of Jalen or Maya hearing those words, understanding what they meant, seeing the hatred on that woman's face directed at their family, at them, was almost too painful for Denise to contemplate. The tirade continued for nearly 5 minutes. 5 entire minutes of Diane Whitmore standing on that porch, finger jabbing at the camera, voice growing hoarse with the intensity of her delivery. She talked about property values and neighborhood standards. She talked about how certain people were naturally louder and more disruptive than others. She talked about where the Washingtons should consider living, neighborhoods that would be more suited to their kind. She talked about patience, wearing thin, and lines being crossed, and consequences that might follow if things did not change. Through it all, the little camera kept recording, the cloud server kept saving, and the evidence kept mounting. Let me pause here for a moment to ask everyone watching something. Have you ever been in a situation where someone revealed their true feelings about you, feelings they had been hiding behind polite smiles and superficial courtesy? Have you ever experienced that moment when the mask finally slips and you see what was underneath all along? I want to hear from you in the comments below. Share your experiences, because I think you will find that far more people have been through something like this than many of us realize. When Diane finally ran out of words, she stood there breathing heavily, waiting for some kind of response that would validate her position or perhaps provoke a reaction she could use to her advantage. Denise felt her heart pounding against her ribs. Her hands were trembling slightly as she held the phone. Part of her wanted to scream back, to unleash 4 years of accumulated frustration and hurt at this woman who had made their lives so difficult for so long. But another part of her, the part that had survived decades of navigating spaces where people like her were not always welcome, knew that screaming would accomplish nothing. It would only give Diane what she wanted, evidence that the Washingtons were exactly what she claimed.